Australians use this abbreviation of GFC for global financial crisis, and I'm using that as the marker there. And clearly Spain, it's certainly improving, but it's a long way above what it was before the crisis hit. The same for France, the same for Spain. Only Germany is in a better situation in the European Union than it was before the crisis. And America, Germany again is the only country which has a lower rate of unemployment than America right now. So definitely, okay, improving, but still not back to anything like what it was before the crisis hit. Now, what I'm curious about is what caused the crisis, what's driving this improvement right now. And my focus has been on the role of credit in economics. And that's curious because according to most economists, credit doesn't have any role in economics. So I want to show one country where that seems to apply. This is Germany, and I'm looking at the relationship between the annual change in private debt, which I define as credit. The reason for that is debt is denominated in dollars or euros. It's a stock in your monetary unit. Credit is the flow of new debt per unit of time. And since we work in years in economics, the annual change in private debt is credit. That's my definition. Now, if you look at it, there's virtually no correlation, trivial, minus 0.75, something you can completely ignore. And I think a lot of what goes wrong in economics is extrapolating for particular economies that don't have the characteristics of the rest of the world. And Germany is clearly one of them. Because looking at France, the story is quite different. Same story. I'm looking now at the correlation, again, of change in private debt, which is credit, versus unemployment in France, and it's now minus 0.62, which is much more significant. Clearly something you need to say, what's causing that? By the way, on each of these graphs, on the left-hand scale, I've got the unemployment rate scaled to whatever is relevant for that particular economy. On the right-hand side, I'm graphing credit as measured as a percentage of GDP from plus 40% to minus 20%. And the reason for that range is basically in one word, is Spain, as you'll see in a moment. So the blue line shows credit in France peaking at about 12% of GDP before the crisis, 12% after as well, running about 10% of GDP right now. But there is a strong correlation. Something, if you were an empirically driven person, you'd say, what's causing that? Okay, you'd want to find out what it is. Here's Italy, minus 0.75. Again, an extremely large correlation. Something you'd want to investigate if you were concerned about whatever you're looking at from an empirical point of view. You'd want to know what's driving that. And you can see that in this case, credit peaking at about 15% before the crisis, falling to minus 7%, and for most of the last decade being negative. Now, Spain. This is probably the most stunning chart on this particular issue that I've ever produced. The correlation is so strong, for those of us who are old enough in the room to remember these things, it almost looks like a Rorschach plot. You remember the old Rorschach plots to try to do psychological analysis? Whack an ink blot on a paper, fold it over and see what the pattern was? These are two factors which are so closely correlated, they're virtually perfectly negatively correlated. Now clearly, if you're empirically driven, what is causing that is a major question. And now for reference, the United States, and one of the reasons the United States is so effective at making comparisons like this, despite Donald Trump's recent complaints, it's still, in its sense, the most self-contained economy in the world. Okay? It leaves out a lot of the other factors that affect you, international trade, financial flows and so on. Relative to the size of the economy, they're smaller than the United States than almost any other economy on the planet because it's the biggest economy on the planet. The correlation there, minus 0.89. Clearly, if you're driven by empirical data, you have to say what the hell is causing this? What's the relationship? Now, the causation in the textbooks is there's no causation. The argument in conventional economic theory is there's no relationship between credit and macroeconomics. And my best quote on that comes from Ben Bernanke. This is from his essays on the Great Depression, stating that the reason he rejected Fisher's debt deflation explanation for the Great Depression was that credit is a pure redistribution. It transfers spending power from one person to another, and therefore a bit like a seesaw, if one person goes up, the other person goes down, and the average height of the seesaw does not change. So you don't need to understand credit in trying to understand macroeconomics. And notice that statement, pure redistributions, which he sees as being credit, should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Now that's clearly wrong on the data I've shown you for the crisis. It's also clearly wrong when you look at the data for the Great Depression. So the views that are expressed there by Bernanke are not based on empirical data. They're based on a priori concepts about the role of credit in a model of the macroeconomy. And if you look at mainstream models, DSGE, but also ISLM and ASAD and all the others, they have no role for credit. And that's because the textbook version of banking says bankings are just intermediaries who transfer spending power from one person to another, and therefore no aggregate effect. And that's called the loanable funds model, of course, as most people who have done economics would know in the room. But it basically says banks are intermediaries. Their role is to take money from savers and give it to borrowers, and they charge, the borrowers effectively get the interest rate and the bank effectively charges a fee. That's the notion of what banking is like. Now, for 40 or 50 years, the group of economists that I'm part of has been saying that's clearly wrong about how banks actually behave. And I've had to quote people you've probably never heard of. Has anybody here heard of Basil Moore? Nobody's heard of Basil Moore. Okay. What about Alan Holmes? Okay. Have you heard of the Bundesbank? They're now saying the same thing. Banks can create book money just by making an accounting entry. And this refutes a popular misconception that banks simply act as intermediaries at the time of lending. Now, when we normally talk about popular misconceptions, what we're talking about is something the public believes that the expert knows is wrong. In this case, we're talking about something that the experts believe that most of the public know is wrong. Okay? That's quite weird. When you look at it, now the Bundesbank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Norway have all come out and said banks create money by lending. And therefore an essential part, well, I'm going to show that it's essential, but a serious, significant part of economic theory is wrong. So what does that mean about the impact of that for macroeconomics? Does that fact that the technical model of banking that is taught to students, that is accepted by virtually everybody who does an economics degree, about 1 in 6 reject it, but 5 out of 6 accept it, and they end up getting the big jobs and we get the minor ones. Does it affect macroeconomics?